Welcome to a Leader's Journey podcast. I'm your host, Joel Gunn. Today I'm got with me a friend of almost 10 years, Dan Walters. Dan, good to have you on the show.
Thanks, Joe. Good to be here.
Dan is an A&M graduate. Mechanical engineering was his first degree, and he'll tell us a little bit more about that in a second. But as Dan, as you introduce yourself, why don't you do the introduction and then roll right into that story we were talking about just before we started recording
Yeah.
on Friday. You were in a workshop, and
Yeah.
let's start there. But
Yeah.
greet the folks and tell them a little bit about yourself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dan Walters. Currently live in Austin, Texas with my wife, Linda, of 55 years. Originally, we were from Wichita Falls. We went to elementary school, junior high, high school together. We've now got 3 adult children, 7.5 grandchildren. And So the story I was telling Joel about Friday, I work with an organization called C12, Christian business owners. We build great businesses for greater purpose. We equip the CEOs to build great businesses for great purposes. And we have a thing called a greater purpose workshop. And I find after doing this 10 years, as Joel was a colleague for that 10 years, the biggest question that a Christian CEO has is what is that greater purpose? I know how to build a great business. What's the greater purpose? So we have a workshop for that. And I was mentioning to Joel, the way that I kick that off is I draw 2 parallel lines. And on one, I draw work, and on the bottom one, I draw faith. And I say in this culture, work and faith don't naturally intersect. And I think we've got a room full of people here today who have an angst. They want their work and their faith to intersect. And how does that happen? And we spend the rest of the day talking about that. And quite honestly, that's what I live for at this point in my life.
So you talk about the intersection of faith and work. Where did that first become even a thought for you?
Yeah. Boy, great question. Um, um, for for a decade or so, it was running in the background. I didn't know how to voice it. Linda and I went to Saudi Arabia in 1975. I went to work for Aramco, the Arabian American Oil Company. So we went out there in the mid 70s, and we were both Christians, but just barely. And quite honestly, the uh, Aramco's oil money paid for us to look for God all over the world. We went to uh, Athens, we went to Rome, we went to cathedrals in Europe, we went to Stonehenge, we went to Buddhist temples, we went to some of the most beautiful mosques in the world in those travels with Aramco and uh, but working in Aramco, working in Saudi Arabia, it's a culture where work and faith are not separate. Okay, they're integrated. And I admired that. I wanted that, but I had that angst. I didn't know how to connect those two. We moved back to the States for 6 years, and during that time, excuse me, a man in Houston. We moved to Houston, and a man there started discipling me. And long story short, 6 years later, we went back to Saudi Arabia. This time with God and a more active faith and seeking faith. And Joel, we got there just in time for Saddam Hussein to invade Kuwait, 2 weeks after we returned. And um, some may remember that period of time. For about 6 months during Operation Desert Shield, the U.S. military spent 6 months bringing in 500,000 troops. Well, those first few weeks, we were living in Dhahran, and um, that's where the 82nd Airborne came in almost immediately, and then the 101st Airborne. And the way we looked at it, they saved our life. And we did what any reasonable person would do. On the weekends, we loaded up our Blazers and Suburbans, and we drove out in the desert and fed the 82nd Airborne, the 101st Airborne, the 1st Marines. We fed them hamburgers and ice cream. Uh, just a precious time with those guys. And after hamburgers, I would say, well, you guys, we're going to have a little informal worship service here. If you'd like to stay, go. And Joel, I never prepared a message. I would just ask one question. We'd sing a song or two, and I'd ask, what's God been doing in your desert? What's God been doing in your life since you came to the desert? Oh, and these guys had story after story of God at work. And one night we were with the 24th Mechanized Infantry, and I asked the question, and it was crickets. And finally, the first sergeant stood up. In an infantry company, it was quiet before, it got really quiet then. And he said, okay, I'll tell you. He said, since I came to the desert, I've learned to be a first sergeant and a Christian too. Whoa. Blew me away. Had two thoughts immediately. First, first sergeant, you don't fit the Christian profile. First Sergeant Marvin Jenkins, 17 years in the Army. And I'd been in the military, and I said, you don't fit, in my mind, I'm thinking, you don't fit the profile. You've got to cuss really well. You've got to get angry in a hurry. You don't fit the profile. And then my second thought was, wow, that's what I want. I want to be a manager in this oil company and a Christian too. And I don't have a clue what this guy's talking about. Hmm. And that was a pivot point, in my major pivot point. Over time, it took me a few weeks to realize how influential that was, and what angst I had there. And so the rest has been a journey along those lines. And when I joined C12 10 years ago, I told Buck Jacobs, the owner, my calling was to hear Christian business owners say, I've learned to be a CEO and a Christian too, just like the first sergeant. It's that simple, Joe, for me.
Yeah. What do you think people struggle with most in
Hmm.
living out their faith and work? You saw it.
Yeah,
You saw it overseas in the Muslim world. Um, they
yeah.
they see them very integrated. But in our Western culture, we tend to have historically, at least, I don't know, the last number of decades, have started to segregate those. What's the disconnect, and how do you start to encourage people to reconnect?
Boy, that's a great question. I've thought about that a lot when I find someone that feels that divine disconnect. I try to quickly tell them, you're not the only one, and you're not the crazy one. Okay. I think it's common. I think, um, well, first in this culture, there's separation of church and state. I ask that question when I get in these workshops. I'll ask that very question. Why do you think these lines don't intersect? And I hear, well, separation of church and state. And well, you don't talk about politics and religion, and kind of go down that road. But I think in large part, it's because uh, people just don't have a narrative. They don't have a go by to what it looks like to align your work and your faith without being Billy Graham or Mother Teresa. You know, how do you do it as a computer programmer? How do you do it as a welder? How do you do it as a CEO? Uh, what's the narrative? And interestingly, I like to tell people there are some narratives in the Bible. I mean, you think about Joseph. He was the CEO of an agricultural co-op, and he wasn't a full-time missionary, and God used him. There was Nehemiah. He was CEO of a construction company. God used him. Daniel, he wasn't a CEO, but he was a political governor in charge of the sorcerers and magicians, for goodness sakes. And he aligned his work in his faith. So the narratives are there. And I think people, to a large extent, just haven't seen that narrative.
Once they once they start to wrestle with this idea of integrating faith at work, um, what are some of those baby steps that, say, somebody's viewing
Hmm.
this or listening to this
Hmm.
podcast, and they're like, yeah, that's been something I've been wrestling with. What do you what do you recommend as some of those early baby steps to start to live
Yeah.
that out? All right, because there's
Yeah.
this fear that for most people, like, I'm not Billy Graham, I'm not C.S. Lewis, I don't really know how to present or defend, or I'm not able to, I'm not an evangelist. Like, there's all these things that keep us from taking those
Yeah.
steps. 'Cause where do you start?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I I think initially there are three things, and let's talk about leaders and how do they align their work into the faith. Because also when I talk to a group of, I'll come to your question, but one other thing, when
Mhm.
I talk to a group of leaders who are Christ followers, they say, well, I want to acknowledge my faith at work, but I just don't want to offend anybody.
Mm,
I don't want any pushback. And I understand that. And I understand too that the Son of God on earth couldn't do this without pushback.
mm,
And we're to be Christ-like. So I mean, that's a fear that's got to be overcome. And God didn't give us the spirit of fear. He gave us the spirit of power, love, and a sound mind, the Bible says. So to your question, what are the baby steps? I realized early on in my C12 career, there are three things. Uh, First, you've got to be willing to turn into the headwinds.
mm,
It it's not easy at the top. It's hard at the top. Uh, and you can be a CEO, you can be a Christian. What's hard is to be both at the same time. And you got to be willing to turn into the headwinds. It's not going to be easy. You just got to accept that. So are you ready to turn into the headwinds? Secondly, uh, I find people need a source of new ideas.
mm,
The old ones in this regard aren't working too well. So you need a source of new ideas. Um, and third, you've got to find a way to deal with the loneliness. And usually when I say that in a group of people, there are two or three moans in the audience. Oh, yeah. Got to find a way to deal with loneliness. So, kind of drill down, double tap on some of those. Go back to ready to turn into the headwinds. I think when that holy discontent, that angst gets strong enough, people are ready to explore. I find too there's a realization that maybe Jesus was right when he said, if you acknowledge me before men on earth, I'll acknowledge you before my Father in heaven. Another place he says, I'll acknowledge you before the angels in heaven. But then right behind that, he says, if you deny me on earth, I'll deny you before my Father in heaven.
mm,
Oh,
mm.
okay. Well, there's a carrot, there's a stick. So there comes a realization, there comes a time I just need, if nothing else, I just need to acknowledge Christ. And what does that look like for you without being Billy Graham, Mother? And maybe you want to be Billy Graham, Mother Teresa. That's okay. But there comes a time when you realize I'm ready to explore. Uh, Going a little deeper on this one, I've found, and I've two or three times in my life I've reinvented myself professionally. And 12 years ago, I was 13 years ago, I was 64 years old. I knew I needed to reinvent myself one more time. It'd probably be the last time. So I spent a year trying to find my calling, create my calling. For a friend, Barry Rowan, calls that his encore calling at that point in life. And I read a little book by DeCoster, and it says, you don't create your calling, you discover your calling. Because if there's a calling, there's a caller. Oh, okay. And if there's a caller, well, your energy source and everything falls in line behind it. So I think some people get to a point where they just want to identify their calling. They realize it's a journey of discovery. Number two, you got to find a source of new ideas. Boy, there is so much out there now. There are podcasts that have been written on faith and work. There are websites. There are just a ton of books. 13 years ago, when I started researching this on my own, trying to be intentional about what the first sergeant taught me, there were only about three books then, Joel.
Hmm.
There was Doug Sherman here in Austin wrote Your Work Matters to God, and then you had to go back to 1947, and Dorothy Sayers in the UK wrote a book on work and faith. And then you had to go back to the 1500 with Martin Luther. He wrote on this. But now then there's a lot of good ideas out there. So, and C12 spends time on coming up with curriculum and new ideas in this area.
Mhm.
And then how do you deal with the loneliness? Well, there is there peer advisory group. There's power in peer advisory groups.
Mhm.
There's secular peer advisory groups. There's professional peer advisory groups where people get together, professional societies and associations. There's just power in that. So, if you can team up, if you can find some other leaders that want to go down these three steps together and have this angst, I think those are the baby steps. I guess too, I would preface this. There's also some permission to play that you just hopefully will already be doing, and that's a commitment to personally meeting with the Lord every day, however you want to call that, devotional
Mhm.
quiet time or whatever. That's permission to play.
Mhm.
Being involved in a church, that's permission to play. Um, so where do
Yeah.
we get started there? Put me back on track. I'm rambling now.
No, no, I like what you said about we can only give out of what we have, right? And so if we're not walking the walk, it's we can talk the talk all day long, but it's going
Yeah.
to be hollow at best, and people know when we're genuine, and certainly they know when a leader's being genuine. And so if our faith is not a genuine experience, it's going to be hard to put on the show of
Yeah.
faith at work. And so, but at the same time, I don't want to discount that leader's initial desire, right? That seed that says, "Hey, that first sergeant made that statement, and God used that as a seed in your heart to begin to germinate.
Hmm.
Hey, there is a way forward where you can be this and a Christian, right? As you
Hmm.
gave many
Hmm.
examples earlier. And so, for the leader that says, "I want to be a leader of whatever it is I'm leading and a Christian at the same time and merge those two." Um, you mentioned some baseline things, which I totally
Hmm.
agree with. What would those next things start to look like? How do
Hmm.
you start to
Hmm.
have those conversations, or how do you start to? I mean, is it just walk out? Kind of. There's a story of when I was C12 chair, invited somebody into our organization, into our peer group, and a business owner, and he felt like he wanted to start sharing his faith in his company. And it's a really cool long story. I'll share some other time. But essentially, he just came out in a staff meeting one day and said, "Hey, all of you know I'm a Christian, and one on one we've had those conversations. But I've joined a peer group recently called C12, and I feel like I should be more vocal about my faith because that's who I am. And so if you guys would give me permission to do that, I'd like
Hmm.
to, open meetings in prayer and just be more of who I
Hmm.
am out in the open." And one of his people that wasn't a Christian came to his office after the meeting and said, "Hey, I'm glad you finally came out of the closet about your Christianity." You know? um,
Wow. Yeah, coming out of the closet. That's good. Hey, bring me back to a minute your question about after the baby steps, what's the intermediate steps? But let me go back to the first sergeant for a minute. It relates directly there. So we were together uh, with him for about an hour, and his men, um, uh, and first when we first got there, we're eating our hamburgers. This was in a tent out in out in the desert in Saudi Arabia in September. Actually, it might have been October 1990. It was hot as blazes. There were no generators, and he and I were hunkered down over in the side of the tent, and he said, "God spoke to me today." This is before we had our conversation. Okay. He said, I was laying on my cot reading my Bible and God spoke to me today. And I said, what did he say, First Sergeant? He said, well, here, I'll show you. And he handed me his pocket Bible and he turned on his flashlight and immediately I'm blinded. And he said, here, right here, this verse that's underlined. And I said, First Sergeant, they're all underlined. He said, no, this one. And it was in Isaiah. It says, you will go through the fire and you'll not be burned. He said, God told me that when we go into Kuwait, that I'll go through the fire, but I'll not be burned. Remember when Saddam's forces left Kuwait, they set the oil fields on fire.
Mhm.
The first Marines, they got to go up the highway, the Kuwait highway, straight into Kuwait City. 24th Mechanized Infantry swung around to the west, and they went through the oil fields. They were on fire. And God had told the first sergeant, you'll not be burned. Boy, that's powerful.
Wow.
Okay. So then we parted company, and about uh, two, well, 6 months later, he wrote me a letter, but of course it had to go back to the States and come back to Saudi Arabia. And in the letter he said, that was really meaningful for me that night. He said that was the first time in 17 years I've ever given my men my testimony.
Mm,
Oh, he came out of the closet that night.
mm,
And that's the first time I've ever given my men my testimony. Now in the desert, preparing to go into Kuwait every night at 1930 hours, we have a time of sharing in prayer. Oh, so, C12 talks about business as a ministry. Man, that's that that's infantry as a ministry. That's ministry in the context of infantry, you know?
mhm, mhm,
So there's that. I think there's just that initial um, when you break the ice. What uh, Satan can only hold us hostage to that which is in the dark.
mm,
Once the light is shined, once we come out, he can't hold us hostage to that anymore. Hold us hostage to something else, but not to that. So I think that's a good first step to, uh, cleverly or clumsily, however, whatever that word is, just acknowledge Christ in your life, however you want to do that. I have found, to your point about what's next, I've found there's three kinds of leaders in this regard. First, and these may be sequential, probably are. First, there's a Christian leader whose faith is private, it's private. It's so private, just like somebody, if he doesn't come out of work, we don't know if he's a Christian or not,
mhm,
or she. We just don't know. Uh, they may be a routine churchgoer and so forth, but we just don't know. That's private. Next, their faith is personal, and it's an add-on to their professional life. And this person goes on mission trips. This person teaches Bible studies. This person um, may be an elder in their church, their leader in the church, and their faith, and they may talk about that at work, but that faith in terms is an add-on to their work. And then there's the category their faith is integrated with their work. There is an intersection. There is a convergence. And in that case, these things that we're talking about in terms of being in the appropriate situation, praying at work, maybe leading a devotional at work, maybe taking uh, work colleagues on mission trips, service projects in the city or whatever, but it's integrated. And it may be more formal than that, and more formal than that. I think this really begins to take off when that leader, that CEO, identifies somebody else to be the point person for ministry in the business, for care in the business, where the leader can champion it, but it just works better when it's volunteer led, and it doesn't have all of the political issues and gamesmanship if the CEO is leading it, and others come alongside. So that's kind of the three steps uh, there.
You mentioned the word care,
Mm-hmm.
and you also mentioned the word ministry almost interchangeably, and I think those are actually good synonyms.
Hmm.
And how do how do you see the more effective? Because you've been around a lot of you coach, dozens of CEOs yourself over the years, and you've been around a lot of successful organizations, both secularly and through your C12 circles. The ones that are
Hmm.
most effective with this idea of businesses, ministry, or caring for your people and your community in a way that would honor God. What do you see them doing? What kinds of things? Right? Most leaders are practical. Like give me some examples of some of the stuff you've
Hmm.
seen out there. The people that
Hmm.
do it well. What do they
Yeah,
do?
yeah, yeah. Um, well, first thought comes to mind is back to what we were talking about. They are solidly grounded in the basics of their faith. C12 has a slogan: "Do is greater than talk." And boy, that's true. We can spend all day long in a C12 meeting talking about stuff, but if you don't leave with some action there, faith without works is dead. C12 without works is dead. Do is greater than talk, and I believe that be is greater than do. Who we're becoming is greater than what we're doing. Okay. Now I've debated this with the CEO of C12, Mike Sherrill, for some time, and I certainly agree. They're not either or; they are both and. Okay, but I find, to your question, I find those um, that are having a vibrant th- their work is a platform for care, Christian care and ministry, and loving people with the love of Christ. That they're becoming, uh, they're growing like Christ in all of life, comma, including their leadership in the business. They are being transformed into Christ likeness day by day, little by little, like in Corinthians, where it says, you're being transformed into Christ likeness, into the image of Christ, degree by degree, day by day. So it's a personal thing for them first. And I find that others that try to do it before they're becoming, it's just hollow. It just is hollow.
It's transactional.
Um, yeah, it's transactional. Yeah, good, good, and not relational. Yeah, for sure. So those that are doing it, and you've already said you can't give what you don't have. Also, I find faith to be real has got to be tested, and faith to be real at work has to be tested. A leader's faith in business to be real has to be tested. So that comes back to turning into the headwind. So they've learned to deal with that. I find too that those that are successful here, if we use that word, um, they use if they're entrepreneurs, they use the entrepreneurial process in creating their ministry, their Christian care. They realize you have a vision. God gives you a vision. God gives you the calling. You head off that way, and if that works, great. If it doesn't, you pivot. You change. Uh, and just like they hire people to do Rev Gen, they hire people to do operations, they hire people to do HR, they hire people to do financial management. They appoint somebody to be the point person in this care, in this ministry. in this Christian service. Um, I think there are some activities that some bases to be touched. Okay. Oh, I think also these people realize, and I've led these workshops and I work with these leaders. They want to hit a home run. Hey, right, just step up to the plate. Let's swing for the fence to be on this. We're going to start this ministry in this company.
Mhm.
Well, that's good, and I hope they hit a home run. But bunts and base hits will advance you around the bases.
Mhm.
This may start with a book study. Maybe the leader just has a book, and then after a couple of books, it's a Christian book. It's
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis or something. And
Yeah.
then, oh yeah, you appoint somebody else to lead the book study. And so it's evolutionary. It's a journey of discovery.
Yeah.
Okay. It's
Yeah.
the entrepreneurial process, whatever you want to call it. I do think there is a place, a lot of more popular now is a corporate chaplain. There are two companies out there, one you're very familiar with, Marketplace Chaplains. There's Chaplains of America, and there's others. And that's huge. And you can call them, rather than call them a chaplain, I've got a member that refers to them as care coordinators. Yeah. And that's kind of awkward at first to get started, but where it really takes takes off is when there's a crisis or disaster in the company, and a beloved coworker is killed in a car wreck or has cancer or loses a child or whatever, and this chaplain, this care coordinator, is gets word of this, and they're in the emergency room before the family gets there sometimes.
Mhm. Mhm.
That's huge. They're used to dealing with this, and the company and the HR department isn't. So there's a role for that. Okay.
Yeah.
I find too when you talk to those people, if the company has kind of an intentional uh, ministry, um, they will say, the ministry takes care of the Christians. The people I talk to and the people that come seek me out are those that haven't identified as being a Christian, and they just want somebody to talk to about life. Okay. So it's beginning to work when you see that. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good. Those are some great examples, Dan. I want to be aware of your time.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts as we bring this episode to a close?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I've got a lot. Let me triage some of them, huh? Uh, I guess. Well, I'm looking at a book on my table over here. There are so many good resources right now. Earlier this year, uh, my C12 members and I, there's a book called The Spiritual Art of Business by Barry Rowan.
Hmm.
Good thing it's a thin little book. It's 40 chapters, but they're only 2.5 pages a chapter. So it lends itself for a devotional. And that's what we did. And if somebody's interested in this stuff, one way to get started is just to read that daily or to team up with a couple of people, okay? Or a group, and read through that day by day. I've got people that are going through that now for the second and third time. Barry Rowan is a guy, he's led 7 very large companies, either a CFO or CEO, some of them publicly traded. And in his book, he talks more about the failures than the successes. And and his journey of Christ along the way and growing like Christ along the way and the upsets. And that's one of the best I've run across. There's one also by a man named Jordan Rayner called The Sacredness of Your Secular Work. Oh, man, that's good. That is a first sergeant kind of book, The Sacredness of Your Secular Work, and what the Bible has to say about work, not only in this life, but the next. And for some, that's an attention getter that we're going to be working in heaven. And in Isaiah, God says about that time in the new heaven, new earth, my elect shall long enjoy the work of their hands. Oh, that's that's a good. So ending thoughts would be there's ways to the first step to get in here or that way. So those come to mind. Certainly for a CEO or business owner, they can explore C12. Just go online, c12.com. There is my favorite podcast in this regard is Faith Driven Entrepreneurs.
Mm.
Just some great podcasts, kind of like yours has been around for a while, and talking to people that are trying to walk the talk. Those would be some initial thoughts.
Yeah, great. Well, Dan, thank you so much for your time and, of course, your words of wisdom. You're one of my favorite people on the planet, and I really appreciate you taking time out of your very busy schedule to spend a few minutes here.
Yeah. Bill, you're very kind. I thank you for this opportunity. Give my regards to Christina.
Yes, sir. Be blessed.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of A Leader's Journey podcast. If you enjoyed it, give us a thumbs up and remember to subscribe to our channel.